Hopefully in 2021, I'll be able to come to your library with a vaccine and treatments of COVID-19. Kent is a very nice place. The downtown is really, really a nice little place, a slice of Americana. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been doing talks for about 25 years. I started in the radio and TV business back in 1971 at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, New York. I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio, and it was 11th grade English. And he said, "Student, you have a good voice." I said, "Thank you." He said, "How would you like to be on radio?" And I said, "In the worst way." And I was on a show called Tiger Talk. And Joe D opened doors for me with the Bergen Record and the Nyack Journal News back in those days. And by 1978, I was on WNEW radio in New York, 50,000 watts of William B. Williams and Frank Sinatra and Johnny Mathis and Tony Bennett and the American Songbook. And I got on because John Lindsay told me that he was running for senator in New York. So WNEW and the rest of my career. I did a radio show, or I was part of a radio station, WGRC in Nanuet, New York. We had the golden age of radio, noon to 2 o'clock every Sunday afternoon. And I did a talk on that, and I said, you know what, the companion piece is TV. And let's wish the WRGV TV in Schenectady a happy birthday. Actually, it's WGY TV, because it was in 1928 that WRGB, then called W2XB, started as the world's first television station, and it was broadcast from the laboratories of General Electric in Schenectady. And you'll find the early days of TV, early days of radio, it was General Electric, it was Westinghouse in the United States in their labs. This TV station is still around today. It's WGY TV. Now, back in the 1980s, I was at Gallagher's Restaurant on 8th Avenue and 52nd Street in New York. And another guy walked in at the same time as me by the name of Howard Cosell. Now, Howard Cosell, his grandsons, Justin and Colin, we still happen to be friends. And Howard, for some reason, when I was 27, 28 years old, thought I was okay to talk to. And we had a very, very good relationship to the point where he invited my wife to sing at an event that he was, a charity event. So I never had any problems with Howard Cosell. But Cosell, this particular day, we walk in, and this is before he had a couple of martinis, and he looks at me and he says, you know, when they write the history of TV, they're going to write about the 3 C's. Cronkite, Cosell, and Cossin, and not necessarily in that order. Now, if you follow Howard's inane or insane logic, inane, insane, doesn't really matter when you're dealing with Howard, he has a point here, because Walter Cronkite, this is a 1960s and 70s icon, the most trusted man in America. Why? He pulled down his glasses, read to the world on November 22nd, or the United States, on November 22nd, 1963, that the president, John F. Kennedy, had died. The glasses are down, sheds a little tear, composes himself. The glasses are back on. Old Iron Pants, and that's what it was called, Old Iron Pants, is back in the saddle. For that, he became the most trusted man in America. And that's Howard. Monday Night Football. Howard was the first employee hired by Roone Arledge for Monday Night Football. Why? Because it was more than a football game. It was supposed to be an event, and Howard was supposed to be one of the comedians, and he needed a foil. He needed a straight man, Don Meredith. Howard was, as he told me in 1974, he said, I'd like to see you do this. He was the most beloved and the most hated man on television in America simultaneously in 1974. Here's Johnny. Johnny Carson started in 1962. He was done in 1993. He was done. 31 years. Television, it's about 17 lifetimes. Johnny started in New York, a 90-minute show following the local news. It eventually got cut down to 60 minutes. And he eventually only had to work about 3 or 4 days a week. But if you were a comedian, and if Johnny called you over to that couch, you had it made. I have a number of people I know because I've spoken on cruise ships who were on the Carson show. One guy who you probably never even heard of, Wayne Cotter, who's on cruise ships, well, not right now. And he told me that Johnny used to just invite him. He didn't even have to do his stand-up routine. He just came out and chatted with Johnny. But if you were a comedian, that was it. But Cosell's, in his meandering, talking about the 3 C's when they write about the history of TV, was right in a way. Nobody has replaced Cronkite. Nobody has replaced Howard, and nobody has replaced Here's Johnny. Television, like I said, the labs, the Pittsburgh lab in 1923, Vladimir Kozma-Zworykin invented the iconoscope, which was a tube for television transmission. They didn't even know what television was in those days. He was working in Pittsburgh at the time. Meanwhile, another guy, Philo Farnsworth, was busy trying to get a picture transmission. By 1927, he was able to. And for the old timers in here, people like me, I'm 64 years old, remember those horizontal lines and how you had to go and play with the dials and all that other stuff? Well, blame Farnsworth. 60 horizontal lines made a television screen. And those TVs from the 50s and 60s were rolling and rolling and rolling, rolling and rolling like Rawhide. That was part of the Rawhide song. So he was responsible for that. The United States, Europe, work on TV going into the 1930s, but it was the Nazis, the Germans, that actually perfected television. The first regular electric television service begins in Berlin. That's March 22nd, 1935. It used a 100-line system. TV in Germany was on the air 3 times a week for up to 90 minutes, and it was going to be used as a propaganda tool. It wasn't going to be used for entertainment. This was going to be purely propaganda because the 1936 Summer Olympics were taking place in Berlin, and it was supposed to be Aryan society. The Aryans were going to be on the podium, and they were going to show how Germany, returning to the world, had these great athletes and ready for world domination, except that guy in the middle, Jesse Owens, kind of messed up some of Adolf Hitler's plans by winning gold medals. During the 1936 Summer Olympics broadcast, up to 8 hours a day, people in Berlin and Hamburg could watch television and the Olympics. It was intended for propaganda, but it never really sold. Number of TV sets reached a small amount of viewers, and then the Nazis scrapped that and went on to other things. In 1939, England, the BBC finally gets television going. And the first soap opera, maybe, play, whatever it is, it's called Condemned to be Shot by R.E.J. Brooke. And it's live from the BBC London studios at Alexandra Plaza, Palace, Alexandra Palace. And that starts March 4th, 1939, but that would be rather short-lived. Meanwhile, in the United States, I did this talk last November, a place in Long Island, and there was a senior home in Long Island, and there was a 90-year-old guy, 91-year-old guy in the audience, and he looks up and he says, I remember that. I was there. And I said, oh, you were? What was it like? He said, well, one guy pulls me aside and pulls my parents aside. And they said, can we have your child on TV? We want to put him on TV. And so they took him into a back room there with a camera, and his parents see him on TV. I said, do you have a tape of that? Said, oh, no, they didn't do tapes in those days. But a lot of people who I've given the talk with, this talk over the years, told me about being at the New York World's Fair in Queens and going into this futuristic pavilion to watch this thing on TV. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was good, and they knew one day it may be in their house. And this was a pavilion that was sponsored by RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. David Sarnoff, the chairman of the board over there, and of course they are pushing RCA TVs. Radio Corporation of America tells you what television will mean to you. On April 30th, RCA Television was introduced into the New York metropolitan area. I don't think in Kent you would have been able to get the signal because the signal only went for about 50 miles, north, west, east, and south. But they tell you, listen, you're going to be able to see Toscanini, boxing matches, award shows, news, quiz shows, sports, all on your television, all in your living room. And, well, it may cost you a lot of money at first, but you're going to enjoy it. Not too far from Kent, of course, is the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Museum. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I went up there, really nice September Sunday afternoon. And I had a couple things to ask. Actually, I had 3 things to ask Roosevelt. One was why, because I do talks on this, why did you allow athletes to compete in Berlin during the Olympics, and why wasn't there a boycott? Okay, that's from one talk I do. Another talk I do is on baseball, and I asked him, want to know about the green light letter, which allowed baseball to play following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the other was, Roosevelt is the first person on television in the United States, April 30th, 1939, when the World's Fair opened. And I wanted to ask him, were you nervous going before the camera? I assume he wasn't because of all the fireside chats and everything. But he appeared at the opening ceremony of the 39 World's Fair, and he gave a talk, and it was on TV, and it reached 400 television sets in the New York City area. A couple of the milestones that year, May 17th, the first baseball game, was Princeton against Columbia. It was on TV from Baker Field in Upper Manhattan, right where Manhattan and the Bronx are nearly meet and cut off by the water. Now, you may know this guy. This guy, Walt Disney. You know, ABC today is part of the Walt Disney Company, Walt Disney was in on the ground floor of television, both in England and in the United States. And Disney is going to reappear in this talk a couple of times. Want to buy a TV? Well, RCA, General Electric, Dumont, and others began selling television sets to the public in the New York City area after the World's Fair opened. Screen sizes range from 5 inches to 12 inches. This is kind of a 5-inch TV I'm holding in my hand here. The Dumonts, which were furniture pieces, were 14 inches and 16 inches. Prices started at $200. They went as high as $1,000, which is about $1,800 to $9,000 for a TV. But you can get one of those big 70-inch TVs, what, for $300 now? Prices eventually went down. Now, I talked about Disney. And here you are, you're a kid, you're one of the 400 people in the New York City area that has access to TV, and you see there's going to be a cartoon on. And you figure, oh, it's going to be Mickey, it's going to be Donald, it's going to be Minnie, it's going to be somebody you know, somebody you want to see. But the first Disney cartoon and the first animated cartoon, Gus Goose, he was a slob. He's kind of he was just a slob. Food all over the place, unkept and all that. And it was Donald's cousin Gus. That was the cartoon that was on. Now, somebody needs to explain to me how a duck and a goose are cousins. But I guess it's cartoons and anything can happen. No Mickey. But anyway, Donald's cousin Gus, May 19th. They are on W2XBS, which later becomes Channel 1, WNBT, and then eventually Channel 4, WNBC TV in New York. Donald's cousin Gus, who did not make too many more appearances after this. He is the first character, cartoon character ever to be seen in the United States. You know, in England, it was Mickey Mouse. Here we got Gus. On August 26th, the first Major League Baseball game is telecast, a doubleheader. Remember doubleheaders in baseball? Doubleheaders, thing of the past. Cincinnati Reds play the Brooklyn Dodgers, Ebbets Field, Brooklyn. That's where RCA set up for not only baseball, but football as well. The Brooklyn Dodgers would be the first team to be seen normally on TV. And there's the Brooklyn Dodgers football team of the National Football League, a team that was owned by a bootlegger by the name of Big Bill O'Dwyer. This is a game in Pittsburgh. And this is a cover of my ebook about football. But the Brooklyn Dodgers, beanie feathers there. See how that may be unnecessary roughness there. See how the defender is taking him down with that fist, strategically placed as Beanie tries to get some more yardage. The first TV exposure, the Brooklyn Dodgers played the Philadelphia Eagles from Ebbets Field, September of 1939. And 1,000 TVs. I wonder what the ratings were. I bet you the ratings weren't bad for that. They were probably the highest rated TV show, as always, in the NFL's case. 1,000 TVs in the New York City area by that point. Meanwhile, World War II, September 1st, 1939 starts, and that ends television in Europe. On August 31st, 1939, 18,999 television sets were sold. They never rounded up before the manufacturing stopped due to World War II. Meanwhile, in the United States, World War II would not start until December 7th. NBC and CBS did begin before the start of World War II in the United States. The war would delay TV's progress, but it was a temporary delay. When the GIs did return home, television would grow quickly because GIs wanted to buy their own houses, they wanted to go to school, the GI Bill, and they wanted to live in suburbia, not the urban settings anymore. But before the war starts, March 10th, 1940, the Metropolitan Opera, which is still on TV, and theoretically the longest running show on TV, the Metropolitan Opera broadcast for the first time from NBC studios at Rockefeller Center. On August 29th, 1940, the CBS color system is introduced. Peter Carl Goldmark announced his invention of the color television system. It wouldn't be until about 15 years later that shows really started to be seen in color. For those of you who hate commercials, that is a look at the first TV commercial, or one of the first TV commercials. It's for Bulova watches. NBC, RCA, Bulova watches. And you can see the test pattern has been changed. It's still the test pattern, but there's no Indian on there anymore. There's NBC, there's RCA, and there's Bulova. Bulova pays $14 for the first commercial, which starts on July 1st, 1940. And it's at 2:29 in the afternoon because historians need to know exactly what time this all starts. And what was the first opera? I don't know, Maureen and Joe, but it was Toscanini over at NBC. But 2:29 in the afternoon, history is made, some of which could change your lives, because I know some of you secretly watch those infomercials on TV selling you a doorknob or something. But anyway, somebody had to pay for the Brooklyn Dodgers Philadelphia Phillies game, and it was Bulova with the first commercial back in July 1st, 1940. An announcement for Bulova. Bulova watches displays a NBT test pattern modified to look like a clock with the hand showing the time and the Bulova logo down on the bottom. Bulova would eventually have animated commercials. Now, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Ray Forrest of WNBT broadcast special news report concerning the Pearl Harbor attack, and that wiped out the New York Rangers hockey game that was being played from Madison Square Garden, the old Garden, up on 8th Avenue, about 54th Street, not very far away from Rockefeller Center. Channel 2, WCVW, had started in 1941, and they did the first wall-to-wall newscast, so to speak, that night, talking about what happened in Pearl Harbor. They had studios at Grand Central Terminal, and that was really the first news ever covered on TV. Television, 1942 goes dark. The U.S. War Production Board halts the manufacture of television and radio equipment for consumer use, and it would be about 3.5 years later that the ban would be lifted. Also in 1942, the FCC, on April 13th, said you have to cut back to CBS and to NBC, and there were very few stations around here. Channel 1 in New York, Channel 2 in New York, you could only be on for 4 hours a week, which made a lot of sense because there were blackouts at night, and you didn't want any lights at night before radar and all that other stuff in case the enemy decided to bomb New York or somewhere else. But the War Production Board ends the wartime ban on manufacture of radio and television equipment on October 1st, 1945, and I cannot grab this. I'm looking for coaxial cable, and I don't have any coaxial cable in front of me. And that's a shame because this place is loaded with coaxial cable. Coaxial cable, your households are loaded with coaxial cable. Army-Navy football game is transmitted by coaxial cable from Philadelphia to New York. They lay down the cable from Municipal Stadium in Philadelphia to New York, and it is on television. It is the first live broadcast of anything from outside of the New York area. The BBC went off the air in 1939. The last thing on the BBC was a Disney cartoon, but they didn't get Gus Goose. They got Mickey's Gala or Festive Affair. They come back on June 7th, 1946. The first words heard, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me? Jasmine Bligh." And Mickey comes back, same cartoon. They just continue programming from 1939. But you're here to know about American TV, and you're here to know about, people like Jackie Gleason. Jackie Gleason, this is a poster for his CBS television show. Some of you probably watched it. Saturday nights on CBS from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. But Jackie Gleason did not start his career on CBS. He started his career on Dumont Television. Now, some of you may have had the Dumont TV. Those were the big TVs from way back when. They looked like furniture pieces. They could fit in with the cathedral radios. Dumont was the world's first commercial television station, beating out NBC and CBS. And they began operations in September of 1946. Now, Dumont is little more than a footnote today in the history of television and in the history of culture. But listen about Dumont's accomplishments, because they accomplished more than NBC or CBS in the early days of TV. And there should be books written about Dumont, not the failure, but the success of Dumont. On September 15th, Dumont begins broadcasting regularly in the United States. For those of you who like soap operas, October 2nd, 1946, the first television network soap opera. It was called Fairway Hill. That's on Dumont. Some of the shows that you watch maybe on other networks or on Dumont included Ted Mack's original amateur hour, which began on radio in the 1930s. With Major Bowes, Edward Bowes. The Maury Amsterdam Show. You might remember Maury Amsterdam from the Dick Van Dyke Show as Buddy Sorrell. Carl Reiner created that show, and the Buddy Sorrell character was based on some, I don't know, this obscure comedy guy. You might have heard of him, I'm not sure. Mel Brooks? I don't know if you ever heard of Mel Brooks or not. Captain Video and his Video Rangers. I've gone to 2 senior homes in the last couple of years. And there was one woman who told me that her father bought the helmet, and she used to watch Captain Video with the helmet on, along with a guy. He said he didn't know how he got the helmet, but he used to watch the helmet, watch the show with the helmet on. 2 separate stories, one from Greenwich, Stamford, Connecticut, and one from Long Island. And the Arthur Murray Dance Party. There's an Arthur Murray's that's opening up nearby me, so the name it continues. Arthur Murray was a popular show, also Dumont. And then there was this guy, the guy who invented comedy on TV. His name, Ernie Kovacs. And if you watch Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, there was a lot of what Ernie Kovacs did. Quick comedy, cut here, cut there, bang, that was it. Very fast comedy with blackouts and all this other stuff. And Ernie Kovacs and Jackie Gleason came to Dumont because they had to look for talent, as opposed to NBC or CBS. CBS had all those people on radio that they just shifted to TV. NBC, the same thing. Lucille Ball was on CBS radio. She ends up on CBS TV. So they were able to shift talent onto TV. Dumont couldn't. They had no farm system. So they had to go out and find people. They found Ernie Kovacs in Philadelphia. He was doing a local show in 1949, and they put him on the network. Now, the problem with Dumont, there were a number of problems with Dumont. First of all, they didn't buy the right stations or get licensed to the right stations. They had only one UHF station, and that was in Pittsburgh, whereas CBS and NBC decided of the three stations, we want New York, we want Washington, we want Chicago. Not a problem. They would eventually add Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco as owned and operated stations. So most of the television stations were owned by individuals in the markets, and they would look to see what was available, and they look at CBS, oh, you got Lucy, you got Jack Benny, you got Ed Sullivan, or NBC, you got Milton Berle, you got Sid Caesar, you got Nat King Cole. Hey, no brainer, we're gonna take you because Dumont has a whole bunch of non-entities or unknown people. All Dumont could offer was unknowns like Jackie Gleason or Bishop, Fulton J. Sheehan, or Ernie Kovacs, or maybe Hazel Scott. Dumont was also the first television network to do a network newscast out of Washington. The nation's window of the world, on the world. That was in Washington and sent across to Dumont affiliates, which really weren't affiliates, it's just individual station owners cherry picking. So, okay, well, we could take that. The first children's show was on Dumont, The Small Fry Club with Big Brother Bob Emery. It was introduced during the daytime schedule. And you know this guy, of course, Jackie Gleason, and you know Ralph Cramden, right? One of these days, Alice, one of these days, bang, zoom, to the moon. You couldn't do that today. You couldn't do that today. That could have been domestic assault, even though Ralph never hit Alice. You just couldn't have a skit like that today. But it was on Dumont's Cavalcade of Stars that Ralph Cramden first threatened to send Alice to the moon. By the way, the Honeymooners sketches, which became the 39 episodes, Alice is smarter than Ralph, a lot smarter than Ralph. So Dumont, the home to the first network soap opera, first network newscast originating in Washington, and the first live primetime telecast of the National Football League, Saturday Night Football. And one of the people who was involved with the Saturday Night Football game ended up being Howard Cosell's boss. Run, get over here. Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge was part of the National Football League telecast on Dumont. Eventually he would go to ABC Sports, where he would help put together the wide world of sports, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, Olympics, the British Open, and then the prize of all of them, Monday Night Football, which is now in its 51st season. And along the way, he acquired Howard Cosell. So Dumont had Jackie Gleason before CBS, Bishop Sheehan before ABC, and the original Amateur Hour before NBC. Dumont knew how to make a good TV. They knew how to make a good TV. They just didn't know how to run television stations. And unfortunately, they are primarily remembered as a purveyor of low-budget programming. But that's rather unfair because most television in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s was low budget, really low budget, particularly outside of New York or Washington or Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And even in San Francisco, lots of low budget programming. So that's kind of unfair to label that with Dumont. The last non-sports program on Dumont was a game show called What's the Story? It aired on September 23rd, 1955. And Dumont did have some sports rights, which ended up on individual stations. But that was the end of that. They went out of business. And there's a long story about the videos that Dumont had, or the kinescopes, They were being stored up in a warehouse in the Bronx. Lawyers got involved in the battle. One lawyer decided he was going to end everything. He went up to the warehouse in the Bronx, loaded up some trucks, took the trucks to the East River, and threw the kinescopes into the East River. And that was it. That was it. So we have some what's left over from Dumont because Jackie Gleason actually kept his shows. There are some other shows that are floating around, literally floating around, not in the East River, but in private collectors' hands. And but there's not very much left of Dumont. Meanwhile, there were 44,000 television sets in use in the United States in 1947. Some of you might remember the name Henny Youngman, rapid fire comedian. His big line, "Take my wife, please." Well, Henny Youngman was a rapid fire comedian in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, going into the 60s. And he died a bitter man. And here's a story that you probably don't ever hear about. It's from a friend of mine who's 93 years old by the name of Bob Block. He lives in Reno, Nevada. And Bob owned a comedy club in Milwaukee in the 1950s and 1960s. Bob also invented pay TV in the United States, which I don't get into in this talk, but he invented it in the early 1970s. If you were in New Jersey, you might remember Wometco Home Theater. That was Bob. Anyway, Bob's telling me a story today. He said, "Do you ever know that Henny Youngman died a bitter man?" And I said, "No, tell me the story." He says, "Yeah." He says his agent gets a call from NBC. Henny was booked to do the royal performance before Princess Elizabeth in London. And that was booked in. They wanted him there. And of course, Henny came from England. His agent calls. He says, "Listen, NBC is taking the Texaco Star Theater and they're moving it from radio to TV, and they're not interested in Fred Allen being a host." And if you saw Fred Allen, you'd know why, because Fred had a face made for radio. Although he's a great comedian, real quick-witted, great comedian who once said about TV, TV is called a medium because it's never done well. Okay, we'll let that go. But Henny has a choice. His agent says, "Listen, they're interested in you to host the show, but the show coincides with the royal performance in London. That's a one-shot deal, maybe. You may never get called again, and as far as TV goes, it may be a passing fad and fade away. I'm not going to make the decision for you. You make the decision. You decide whether or not you want to do the show or cancel it out, or you want to do the TV show." While he's dithering and trying to figure out what's going on, that is Miss Martha Roundtree. And usually when I'm live, I ask the question, what is the longest continuous running show on television? If you think you know it, you can put it in the box, but I'll save some time and I will tell you that the longest running television show on American TV debuted on November 6, 1947, going from radio to TV from Mutual Radio. I spent time with Mutual Radio in the 1980s and 1990s. Learned all about Kelsey's Nuts, if you remember that from the 1930s, from a guy by the name of Jim Gannon out of Chicago. Anyway, Mutual Radio to NBC TV, and that was Martha Roundtree. She created and hosted Meet the Press. Her partner became Lawrence Spivak. He bought her out. Martha Roundtree and a lot of women had a lot more juice in the 1940s than they did up until recently in journalism. You had the woman who broke the story, Clara Hollingsworth, that the Germans invaded Poland. She was on the border in September of 1939. You had Ruthie Gruber, who is the photojournalist who took pictures of after the liberation in 1945, and also got Roosevelt, then Harry Truman, to, well, actually it was Roosevelt, to get about 1,000 Jews out of Eastern Europe and relocated them to Oswego. And there's been a play done by my friend Bob Block and Bill Goldstein about Oswego, and there's also a TV special. So women had, and there was Pauline Fredericks. Women had a lot of juice back in those days in terms of being in important roles on TV and in the media. And there is old Stoneface Ed Sullivan, my cousin Jerry Stiller and Mirror. Jerry told me a whole bunch of stories about Ed, who was once the Golden Gloves ring announcer while he was a columnist for the Daily News back in the 1920s. And Jerry told me, he said, you ever watch Sullivan? If you watched Ed Sullivan, you knew he didn't know what he was doing on stage. What he did, he basically reverted to being the ring announcer. Sullivan could make or break you as a musical act. He was also a bit of a civil rights pioneer in that he would invite Louis Armstrong on his show and Ella Fitzgerald and Sammy Davis Jr. And he took heat for having African-American performers on, but Ed didn't care. He thought that they deserved to be on and they deserved the showcase. A quick Ed Sullivan story from Jerry Stiller. Ed had something for everybody. He had for kids, had for teenagers, the Beatles. Ed Sullivan for young adults with small children, for empty nesters, and for senior citizens. So he had a lot of different acts. Two of my favorite acts during the Sullivan days was watching the Dancing Bears from the Moscow Circus and also the Plate Spinners, because he used to go to the Catskills to get acts. I just love plate spinners. And to this day, I still love plate spinners. But anyway, Broadway was dark on Sunday night. And Jerry was telling me the story that Anna Marie Alberghetti was on one night. And she was on Broadway, but it's dark, so he used to have Broadway people on for the empty nesters. And so she's on, she's singing a song. And if you ever watch Sullivan, again, this is the ring announcer. Oh, come on. And so she finishes her song. She gets lukewarm applause. And Ed is getting really upset because he thinks that she should be getting more applause than that. He says, come on, let's hear it for Ave Maria. Usually works better when I don't do Zoom. Anyway, getting back to the Texaco Star Theater. Hey, Kent, it's the Henry Ford Museum near your house, the day we met. Up in Detroit. Anyway, so Texaco Star Theater, they're going from radio to TV, and they're going to try out all these hosts. Henny Youngman ultimately decides he's going to do the royal performance, partly because Ed Wynn bombed out on local TV in Los Angeles. That's a sure thing. TV is not a sure thing. So they're going looking for hosts, and they have some revolving hosts and all that, and they end up with that guy. Uncle Milton Berle. And I have a friend by the name of Larry Strickler. And Larry Strickler was one of the kid actors on that show. And we were talking one day about Bob Bloch's story. And he says, Milton had it all over Henny Youngman. In fact, Larry's now in Florida, gives a lot of talks about the early days of TV and performing on TV in the early days. He said, Milton had a photographic memory. And Milton was a stickler. He said he wanted everything his way, unless you could show him some better way, but there was no better way. He said Milton ran that show with an iron fist, and he said, hey, he pulled it all off, all the skits and everything else. He said Henny was a guy who could tell one-liners. Berle had more versatility, and the public liked him. The Texaco Star Theater was credited with driving American television set sales. The number of TVs sold during Berle's run on the show was said to have grown from 500,000 when it started in 1948. 8 years later, 30 million televisions. Now, not everybody bought TV because of Milton Berle, but a lot of people did in the early days. The Texaco Star Theater is the highest rated television show in 1950-51. That was the first season where the Nielsen ratings were used. In 1950, Ed Sullivan, old Stoneface, hosting the Toast of the Town, got some competition from NBC. It was called the Colgate Comedy Hour. And it was 3 shows in one, linked together. In New York, Joe Franklin. Remember Joe Franklin on Channel 9? Martin Payne, Joe Franklin, a hell of a nice guy. He and his long-suffering assistant, Richie Orenstein, who I knew. I was once up at his office, and if you remember the Collier Brothers, or the story about the Collier Brothers, they had newspapers all over the place. I don't think I saw a spot on the floor that was not covered by newspapers or magazines in Joe's office over on 1440 Broadway. So anyway, Eddie Cantor was the New York host. Abbott Costello was the host. They were in Chicago as hosts, and Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, at the very height of their popularity, were in Los Angeles. Now, this show, I found out, I gave this talk at a senior home in Teaneck, New Jersey about 3 years ago. And this guy happened to be an engineer, retired TV engineer, who for 15 minutes proceeded to tell me how they linked up the show. And I said, hey, you know, they call me Thumbs, you know. But he went on talking about how it was a marvel and how they had to do these 3 separate shows and they had to stitch it together with fiber optics. There is Eddie Cantor making whoopee. There's Martin and Lewis. Boy, Dean looks a hell of a lot older than Jerry in that picture. And there's, hey, Abbott and Costello. Anyway, the first season, to make a long story short, AT&T started a coast-to-coast coaxial microwave interconnection, which allowed the live telecasts from around the country. Production units set up in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They had a lot of talent on the show. But Abbott Costello, probably very overexposed by this point. Eddie Cantor, you know, that was the 1920s, 1930s. He's a little old in the tooth at that point. Martin and Lewis did get them ratings, but old Stoneface would beat them in the end. Now, if you were in Scarsdale in the 1950s and looking for Buffalo Bob Smith's house, you couldn't miss it because he had a big Indian totem pole in the middle of the lawn. And there were always kids around. Buffalo Bob Smith and Howdy Doody. And right now, the Detroit Fine Arts Museum is still fighting over actually, do they own one of the Howdy Doodys or don't they own one of the Howdy Doodys? It's been going on for years and years. I got to check with my friend, Michael Ziegfeld. Michael Paul is his professional name. He's a puppeteer and he did a lot of work with Jim Henson. I haven't spoken to him in a while. We got to find out what's going on with one of the Howdy Doodys. So, Howdy Doody, that's the answer to Bob Emery. Begins December 27th, 1947. NBC wanted the show to compete against Dumont. That show would last until 1960. Children's show. Telecast in color eventually. Why? Well, RCA was NBC's parent company, and they made TVs. And they got into the color TV business, and they wanted to push color TVs. What better way to get your message across than to kids? Want to call TV? 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 Some parents bought screens, colorform screens, green screens to put it over the TV to make believe they were getting some sort of color through a prism or some sort of thing. That didn't work. Initially, 5 o'clock Eastern time, that show was on. Bob Keeshan was Clarabelle. He left to become Captain Kangaroo. And look at these guys. Now, I don't know when this picture was taken, but I surmise this picture was taken in October. And these guys are watching the World Series in front of somebody's appliance store without sound. These 3 guys are watching intently. That woman behind there, she's walking by without a care in the world. And also, it's got to probably be the 1940s because if you look at that car, it looks like a 1940s car. Whoops. See, I get interrupted here, and this is, please stand by. Please stand by. Okay, I think we fixed the technical difficulties. Anyway, those guys are watching, I assume, a baseball game, day baseball. Now, this gets to cable TV and how cable TV was created. There are 2 stories about cable TV. One involves a guy by the name of John Walson. My friend Frank Carney worked with John Walson in the 1970s in the cable TV industry. And Frank, who's now living in North Carolina, told me John Walson did invent cable TV. But there's also a story in Astoria, Oregon, about cable TV. So I'm not sure who really invented cable TV, so let's do both stories. It is claimed that the first cable television system in the United States was created in 1948 in Mahoney City, Pennsylvania by John Walson. And he was a store owner, and he was just trying to sell TVs. Walson was providing television signals to people whose reception was poor because the Allegheny Mountains were blocking television signals out of Pittsburgh. So maybe, just maybe, if I could come up with something and I could show people TV really works, then just maybe I could sell some TVs. Anyway, that's Walson. Frank Carney worked with him in the 1970s, told me some of these stories. Walson erected an antenna tower on top of a nearby mountain by his store so he could take his customers to the location and show, hey, we're getting this cable off the TV. We put the cable to the antenna and, you could see the TV. He was looking to increase his sales, but, going up to the top of the mountain to show how the TV worked, it's impractical. So he decided to do something else. Army Navy surplus stores in the neighborhood. He goes into the Army Navy surplus store and he decides, okay, what do we got here? So he finds twin lead Army surplus wire and he runs the wire on the trees from the mountain where his antenna is to his appliance warehouse, takes people in there, shows them, hey, this is clear TV from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they are impressed, but they say, how do we get it in our house? He said, simple. We'll just run a wire from the TV. So the line goes into the appliance store and to several homes along the way, and he calls it Community Antenna System Television, which is the one story about how cable TV starts. The other story, well, it starts in that building over by Right Shoulder in Astoria. I was there in August of 2018, and you can see behind the building there's a hotel, and then there's a bigger building. And there was a guy by the name of Ed Parsons who lived in Astoria, and he takes his wife to Chicago to watch to a radio convention. He was a radio station owner in Astoria, and he knew a little bit about signals, radio signals. So anyway, he goes to Chicago to this convention, and WBBM TV, which in those days was WKBW, Channel 2 in Chicago is on. And as part of the radio convention, they show people, this is television. And Mrs. Parsons, Grace Parson, decides, I want a TV, I want a TV. Well, it's a problem because no TVs out in the Pacific Northwest at that point, no TV station. So why would you want to buy a TV? But Parsons did buy a television. And right over my right shoulder on that first floor there was Parsons' radio station. And behind him was the radio antenna on one of those buildings. In 1948, Grace Parsons wanted to watch TV in the worst way. And there was a TV station, KRSC TV in Seattle. And somehow, and I've made that trip. My daughter lives in Seattle, so we made the trip down to Astoria a couple of years ago. It's about a 3-hour trip down there. It is generally outside of the reach of normal television, but Parsons was a guy who knew how to play around with signals. And he was playing around with the signal, and the wire, the coaxial cable is into his office where the TV is. And he's playing around, and he gets word. It works. It works. He calls his wife. Grace, guess what? We could get TV. Can we get it in the house? I think so. Runs a wire to the house. They got TV. Well, this becomes a lesson to Mrs. Parsons. Don't invite everybody in the neighborhood to watch TV because Ed no longer has the use of his bathroom or his living room or his dining room because they're watching TV. And I've heard these stories over the years from people in the New York area that were the first to get their TVs in the Bronx. One woman told me she could never get a babysitter because her kids were brats. All of a sudden they had TV and she had more babysitters than she needed. Or neighbors would come in and cook dinner so they could watch TV. This is the Ed Parsons problem. Eventually, he decided he had to get rid of all these people. Well, how was he going to do that? Well, he figured out he could probably split the wires or the antenna and get wires out of there, and his neighbors, all his neighbors could get TV with the cable, and they all bought TVs, and he laid down the cable. He charged them $3 a month, $36 a year. Well worth it for him to get everybody out of his house. And he never told the FCC about it. Why? Well, you know, they don't care about what's going on in the story of Oregon. And if he told them, they may ask questions. And if they start asking questions, he may lose his radio license. So for years and years, he ran pirate TV in Astoria until eventually historians got around and said, yeah, he invented cable TV, and it was okay the way he invented it. But you got Parsons and you got Walsons. Pick your story. One of them came first. Both of them did it. Also in 1948, CBS Television News debuts second longest show on TV with Douglas Edwards. The first network telecast of a political convention was June 21st in Philadelphia, and the BBC, the Beeb. In 1948, the Olympic Games in London, the opening ceremony was broadcast. Well, the woman on the right, Lucille Ball, had been under Bill Paley's contract at CBS Radio, and her husband there, Desi Arnaz, was more of a behind-the-scenes guy. In fact, if you talk about who invented situation comedies in the world, it would be Desi Arnaz with a 3-camera setup. He bought out Howard Hughes' RKO Studios after RKO could no longer be both a studio and also own movie theaters because of the Supreme Court Act. So he buys Howard Hughes' studio out. And they decide they're going to develop a TV show. But there's a problem. There's a big problem. They do develop this TV show, which you know, of course, is I Love Lucy. And Bill Paley is all in on it, the chairman of CBS, except for one problem. How could an all-American girl from Jamestown, New York, on TV be married to a Cuban? And Lucy and Desi said, we're married. Well, you're married in real life, but you can't be married on TV. And Lucy and Desi said, well, if we can't be married on TV, then you don't have a TV show. Well, eventually, Paley succumbed to the idea of having I Love Lucy. This was going to make money for him. And eventually, he allowed Desi Arnaz, who was Lucille Ball's husband, to be her husband on TV. They had some really strange rules on TV back then. If you were a married couple, and they were a married couple, you had to sleep in separate beds. If you sat on a bed, you had to have one foot off the bed. You could not use the word pregnant. All these silly rules that were on TV. Lucy was, of course, in a family way when she was pregnant with that episode with Little Ricky back in the early 1950s. So May 48, Desilu Productions formed by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. Little did they know in 1948 that Lucy was probably going to make a decision that would make some company down the line billions of dollars. We'll get into that at the end of the talk. But the I Love Lucy show started in 1951. And for the I Love Lucy fans, there's always the chocolate factory, the vitamin thing, the Little Ricky in terms of being born. Those are perennially, when I'm live, I ask people who like the I Love Lucy or love the I Love Lucy show, what are your favorite episodes? And I say, don't say it. I'll tell you what they are. And that's what they are. Jack Benny went from radio to TV. Me personally, I love the radio shows. TV shows, not so much. Benny was 56. His cast was also that age. And the stuff that they did on radio, which was funny on radio, just doesn't translate to TV. Great radio performer. TV, they recycled old scripts. Benny was old. He was 56 years old. Rochester was old. Don Wilson was old. Everybody was old, and they just didn't have that much energy. Radio, you would never know it. But they tried it on TV, and Jack lasted about 14 years on and off on TV, and then ended up on shows like the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast. There's Groucho, the one, the only Groucho with the best straight man ever on TV on the quiz show, George Fenneman. Fenneman also did the announcing on the second Dragnet in the 1960s. The story you're about to see is true. There is a story that floats around about Groucho on TV, but it was really on radio, and who knows if it ever happened. It may have happened or may not have happened. Groucho has said it happened, didn't happen. There's no audio that has surfaced. But Fenneman introduces, I call him Fenneman because that's what Groucho called him. Fenneman introduces Marion and Charlotte Story, and they have 20 kids. Groucho asks Mrs. Story why she had chosen to raise such a large family. She is said to have replied, "I love my husband," to which Groucho responded, "I love my cigar, but I take it out of my mouth once in a while." I had a married couple in their 70s. I could see the woman giving the husband the elbow saying, "What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that?" And I said, "I'll explain afterwards." He said, "No, I'll take care of that afterwards." But that story may or may not have happened. I Love Lucy, of course. Some of the other shows, Broadway Open House, which was the template for late night comedy shows. That was put together by Sigourney Weaver's father, Pat Sylvester Weaver, who also did the Today Show. Jerry Lester and Maury Amsterdam were the hosts. Maury left the show, and that left Jerry Lester with somebody by the name of Jeannie Lewis, who was kind of a singer, kind of a vaudeville, burlesque type performer, and he named her Dagmar. Why? I don't know, and he didn't know, but he named her Dagmar. But she became famous. She became really famous and was one of the first stars of early TV that ascended and then descended really quick. Sort of like Kim Kardashian, because she only had 2 assets. And there she is with her 2 assets. Now, I've done this talk at senior places, and there was this one guy about 90 years old. He'd go, "Yes, you get something wrong? Something wrong?" And he's breathing hard. You know, when you see somebody 90 breathing hard, you get a little upset, a little concerned. He said, "No." I said, "So what's the thing?" "Oh, I used to watch her just to breathe." There was another guy, he was 93 years old, and he was going like this to me, like this to me. I said, "What are you trying to tell me?" He said, and he points to the pictures like that. I said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself thinking about that." And he kept going on like that. Anyway, she had 2 assets, and that made her a lot of money for a couple of years. And for car lovers, she was forever honored by General Motors, because in the 1950s, on some of their cars, including that Coupe de Ville, they had Dagmar bumpers. Take a look at the bumpers. 2 cones protruding out of the grill of that car and other GM cars. They were named the Dagmar bumpers. Her career, unfortunately, was over real fast. She rose fast, done, and she ended up doing carnivals and other things. Dagmar. Bum, 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 bum. The story about the sea is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. Dragnet started in 1951, lasted 8 years. It was enduring. Had the famous theme song, Stoller and Lieber. Had Joe Friday in one of their songs, Searching, with other famous people who go searching for criminals like the RCM, Canadian Mounties, and others. There was a second version that was in color, which was actually my favorite version because they had Blue Boy. And you got to watch the episode of Blue Boy because it was Jack Webb at his absolute lunatic best. Marijuana is the fuse, cocaine, something else, the light, and heroin, the bomb. Blue Boy episode and second Dragnet. And there was supposed to be a third Dragnet in the 1980s, but Joe Friday succumbed to a heart attack. Joe Friday, Jack Webb, ruined 77 Sunset Strip because he became the head of entertaining programming over at ABC in the early 1960s and just reinvented, got rid of Kooky, Lend Me Your Comb, which was an early TV show staple back then. Just the facts, man, just the facts. Joe Friday. Dave Garroway and J. Fred Muggs, the Today Show. J. Fred Muggs is still alive, lives in Tampa, living the life of a retired chimpanzee. Garroway died a long time ago. But the Today Show, and you may still be watching the Today Show, 68 years later, it's the same show. Today blended national news headlines, interviews with newsmakers, lifestyle features, light news, gimmicks, local news updates, and now local weather updates from network stations. The formula has not changed since Pat Weaver invented the show in 1952. Steve Allen ruled the night. Don Knotts, Louis Nye, Tom Poston. Don Knotts played an early version of Barney Fife as a man in the street with Steve Allen. The nervous Mr. Morrison. Tom Poston couldn't remember his own name. Pat Harrington, who was on One Day at a Time in the 1970s. He was an Italian golf player, Guido Panizzi. Louis Nye played the smug Gordon Hathaway. He played that kind of character also in the Beverly Hillbillies. And Bill Dana as Jose Jimenez. Bill Dana retired Jose Jimenez in the early 1970s. A friend of mine, Shelley Saltman, grew up with Bill and his brother up in Boston. His brother ended up being a doctor, and he said that he thought Jose Jimenez wasn't politically correct and retired him. Bill Dana, the Jose Jimenez character, the astronauts in the 1960s loved him in the United States because he was the first Puerto Rican to go up into space, Jose Jimenez. Elvis was on the Steve Allen show, but that was a primetime show, all dressed up in tails, along with a basset hound, singing, guess what? You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Elvis didn't like it. Colonel Parker did because he got the exposure. Steve Allen had him on. Steve Allen wrote something like 8,000 songs, something of that nature. Jack Paar came after Steve Allen and before Johnny Carson, actually Groucho Marx, because Groucho did the show for about 6 weeks between Paar.
Steve Allen hated rock and roll.
Yeah.
That's why he did that.
Yeah. But Jack Paar was in between Allen and Groucho, then Johnny Carson. Groucho was a placeholder until Johnny Carson got on. Jack Paar got in trouble, got suspended for telling a joke about WC water closet. And Jack went ballistic and walked off the show for a while and would do other TV shows. There is American's eternal teenager, Dick Clark. I was doing a talk in Northvale, New Jersey, a couple of years ago. A woman said one of her brothers was a dancer on American Bandstand. American Bandstand not only has a significant piece of television history, but it was also a transformational show. Just follow me for a minute and you'll see what I'm saying. Dick Clark was not the original host of the show. He takes over in 1956. The show was on WFIL in Philadelphia, Channel 6, and was simply called Bandstand and featured big band singers. But it would change with Clark coming in, its emphasis from teenagers dancing to popular records. And that woman's brother was one of the dancers. They didn't get paid, but they got limoed to the show in Philadelphia on every afternoon. Dick Clark becomes the host in 1956. Now, the American Broadcasting Company, which was owned by Paramount at that time, would ask the 14 or 15 affiliates that they had, do you have any shows that we could put on the network? And the people at WFIL in Philadelphia said, take Bandstand. And they did. And this starts the transformation of ABC from a really weak network to what it would eventually become in the early 1970s with Monday Night Football and the other shows into a powerhouse. Well, I can't stand when this thing happens. Maybe if I adjust the antenna, that's what I'll do. Anyway, that's my wife in 1982. She's at Disneyland, walking out of the Magic Kingdom. Now, you might want to know, what does my wife in the Magic Kingdom have anything to do with the early days of TV? I'm glad you asked, because I am going to tell you. In 1954, ABC had just 14 affiliates. CBS had 74. NBC had 71. ABC was a really weak network, and they were a little better than Dumont because they were still in business. ABC would talk that Walt Disney is running around Los Angeles. He's got this idea that he is going to build this super amusement park 40 miles south in Anaheim and Orange Grove. Now, back in those days, and some of you might remember it, and this was to the 1960s, there were little amusement parks everywhere. In Queens, where I was for a little while between 1964 and 1968, we had Fairyland, and we had where, if you come off the Whitestone Bridge now, you see the New York Times printing press there. That was also an amusement park. So they were all over the place. You go to San Francisco, out at the point where the Pacific Ocean meets the bay, there was Playland out there. So he's going around and he's looking for somebody to help invest into this project because he didn't have the money for a Disney, because Disney basically, he was a cartoonist, made some money here and there, but didn't have a lot of money. So he went to all the studios. He goes to Paramount, owns ABC. And the Paramount people say, hey, you know what? We like this idea. We'll put up some money for Disneyland, but you got to do a couple things for us. We want 2 shows. Will you do it? Of course, Disney is going to say doing it. Now, the 2 shows were, well, what are the 2 shows? The Mouse That Roared, Walt Disney. One of them, the Mickey Mouse Club. The other was a show about Disneyland. Disneyland and the Mickey Mouse Club helped ABC become profitable. ABC would have money to go to Desi Arnaz and say, what do you got for detective shows? And other producers like Warner Brothers, what do you got for Westerns? And ABC, with the money that Mickey Mouse Club brought in, that Dick Clark brought in, that Disneyland brought in, could become a network. Now, it doesn't become a full network until the late 1960s. They're adding affiliates as this is going on. And one of the shows they picked up was with this guy, Robert Stack. I spent a night with Robert Stack once at Yankee Stadium. He was like Elliot Ness. He was sitting there, I was sitting there. For some reason, he was sitting with what was called the radio guys, because I was a reporter. Terry Garr used to sit with us a lot too. And anyway, Robert Stack was kind of Elliot Ness that night. Didn't have very much to say. Seemed to be nice enough, but didn't have much to say. Watching a baseball game. Oh, by the way, Paramount and ABC, they get the show from Desilu. And it's a show about crime. And there were Senate hearings on crime, and virtually everybody on the show was named Nitti or Capone, although Capone was never seen on the show. I mean, he might have been seen on the show once. And some people from the Italian Defamation Committee call up Desi Arnaz and say, you know, maybe it'd be better off if you didn't have so many Italians on the show. And they took the Italians off the show. And the show's ratings plummeted, and eventually ABC would cancel the show. Rod Serling was on. The Twilight Zone from 59 to 64. A couple of years ago, CBS All Access decided to reimagine the original series with Jordan Peele as the narrator of the new series. You know, let's face it, Rod Serling was a genius, absolute genius. It's going to be tough to duplicate what he did, which was basically using storytelling to explore the human condition and the culture of that particular time, 1959 to 64. Rod had a sense of humor and went on the Jack Benny show and did a spoof on Jack Benny show. And when I was breaking into the business, I used to get tickets to see the Dick Cavett show. And Rod was on the Dick Cavett show one day, and I think they just had a conversation with each other and not with the audience. Interesting guy, though. And if you were in the New York area, you might have remembered this guy with children's shows. Now, I realize not everybody is from New York, so I'm going to identify him. This was 8 years ago, and this was Sonny Fox, who did in the New York area 2 shows, one called Just for Fun, the other Wonderama. And because I have a lot of people who are not from the New York area here today, I'm just going to go through this a bit quicker than I normally do when I'm in the New York area. Uncle shows all over the place in TV. Uncle Don, Uncle this guy, Uncle that guy. That was a staple children's show from the 1950s into the 1970s, all gone by the 1970s. The uncles were concerned with running a smooth show, and personalities came onto the show, disrupted the performance. That was that. Now, in New York, we had Sandy Becker on Channel 5. He did characters. He showed Warner Brothers cartoons. Had Joe Bolton and the Three Stooges on Channel 11 in New York. Captain Jack McCarthy did Popeye cartoons. Chuck McCann, who became a character actor, including being a judge on Boston Legal. Anyway, he did Laurel and Hardy skits, and Soupy Sales was in New York. And I never met Soupy, and that is one of life's regrets. I just never was in the same area as Soupy. And I do know people like Anita Bonita and others who will tell you that Soupy was just a great, great guy, a great guy, and I never met him. Now, here's a question as we come to the end. Could this show be on TV today? Imogene Coca on the left, Sid Caesar, your show of shows. A couple of years ago, I was on a cruise ship, and I met this guy who worked on the Carol Burnett show between 1969 and, say, 1975, 76. And he said, Carol Burnett could not be on today. She had 170 employees in the production company putting that show together. You just didn't have enough money for everybody. Now, I'm going to submit my case as to why you could not have your show of shows on anymore. Here were some of the writers. This guy keeps coming up, Melvin Kaminsky. I never heard of him. Mel Brooks? Who was Mel Brooks? Mel Brooks. Neil Simon, Danny Simon, his brother, Mel Tonkin, Lucille Kalin, Selma Diamond, who was some sort of celebrity on talk shows I remember in the 1960s, Joseph Stein, Michael Stewart, Tony Webster, Carl Reiner, who just passed away at the age of 98. And the bench warmers were Larry Gelbart, who did MASH, and somebody by the name of Woody Allen. Never heard of Woody Allen. Anyway, that was the writing staff. You couldn't put together this writing staff, although Carl Reiner was asked about it, and he said, well, we were all young once. That's true, and they didn't make all that much money off of TV. But that was the roster. And probably in the library, you have the book Laughter on the 23rd Floor, which is all about that TV show. And Sid Caesar was great. I was just watching a PBS thing with Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, and some guy who is the announcer. And they're talking about Carl Reiner, and it was hilarious. I didn't have to watch the show. Just watching Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks together was enough, absolutely enough. That's Nat King Cole. Oh, Nat King Cole was one of the great singers of his time. And NBC decided to give him a prime-time show, Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock following the Milton Berle show. He got the spot after Milton Berle ended the career, his career on TV on that show. Nat King Cole had a big problem. It was called lack of sponsors. But, Nat King Cole is referred to as the Jackie Robinson of television, but he really isn't. The pianist and singer Hazel Scott had a show on Dumont, 15 minutes long weekly. And then the vocalist Billy Daniels had a show briefly, also in the 1950s. They precede Nat King Cole. He is not the first African-American to host a show on TV. In fact, he's about the fourth or fifth. Cole had been a frequent guest on your show of shows. The show would start in 1956. Never got a national sponsor. Rheingold Beer in Hartford, New York City said, okay, we'll sponsor it. Coca-Cola in Houston, Regal Beer in New Orleans, Gallo Wine, Colgate Toothpaste in Los Angeles. That was that. Obviously, you couldn't sustain a show without advertisers. And Nat King Cole could only have his acquaintances so many times. Hey, can you come on the show and kind of get scale instead of getting paid, which you normally would. But if you go up to YouTube, you will see some fantastic shows from the 1950s. My favorite is the one with Frankie Lane because he could not have white people on the show, according to NBC. And he said, why not? And eventually they broke the color barrier, reversed it. Frankie Lane, who sung the theme song from Blazing Saddles, was on that show, and it is hilarious watching the two of them just singing together. They were having a great time. December 17th, the show is over. Cole sings "The Party's Over," accompanied by a montage of photographs featuring Cole and some of the people who were on the show. Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., Frankie Laine. Great show, great talent. Watch it. It's up on YouTube. Nat pulled the plug on the show. NBC wanted to keep it on, but they couldn't justify keeping it on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock because the Singer Sewing Machine Company, the people who sponsored Elvis's comeback special in 1968, wanted the time slot for an adult Western called The Californians because there weren't enough adult Westerns on at that time. David Sarnoff, the chairman of the board at NBC, said to Nat, Saturday nights, 7 o'clock. Nat said no, and it was over. The party was over. Hazel Scott's rather interesting. She was married to the Congressman Adam Clayton Powell III for a little while. She is the first African-American woman ever to have a show on television, on Dumont. But red channels, communist scare, the whole bit, precedes McCarthyism just slightly. But the Hollywood Reporter in the late 1940s put out an article, not sourced, that there were a whole bunch of people who were communists and it ended up ruining many, many careers. Hollywood Reporter would eventually apologize for it only a couple of years ago. Why did they do it? Why did they put out this article with names that didn't mean anything, but they did? June 22nd, 1950, Scott's name appears in red channels. Scott goes to the House Un-American Activities Committee on September 22nd, said, I'm not a communist. I'm not a socialist. I'm from Jamaica. Well, she says, I'm not. Dumont decides Hazel is just too hot to handle. She had no sponsors. They had to get rid of her. Go up on YouTube. Watch Hazel Scott. Tremendous pianist, tremendous pianist. She was a stickler too. And if you read about Hazel Scott in the movies in the 1940s, she made a point that how come she's in the movie and the poor whites are dressed up and poor blacks in the movie are dressed in rags, and she demanded a change in all of that. So she was a civil rights activist. That was probably her problem. She ended up in Europe and came back to the United States in the 1970s and was on General Hospital. And there is Hattie McDaniel. She was, of course, Gone with the Wind. Ethel Waters, Hattie McDaniel, two of the four Beulahs, Queen of the Kitchen, lasted 2 years on the Week Network, which you found in the early days of TV. I remember Irma, that was about a Scandinavian family. There were more stereotypes back in stereotypical families, ethnic families back in the late 40s and 50s. Eventually, they would all be washed out. Amos and Andy made it to TV, and there were white actors playing Amos and Andy. There were black actors playing Amos and Andy and Kingfish and Swordfish and everybody else on the show. And it was successful. There were 52 filmed episodes. And the beer that made Milwaukee famous, at least in the 1950s, and Vic Damone sang their theme song, the Blatz Brewing Company. They were all on board. Television series used black actors. This was an authentic show, except the NAACP didn't like it. They didn't like Kingfish. They didn't like Amos and Andy. They didn't like anything about the show. And they said, you know what? We're going to boycott the sponsors. It was a popular show in 1951-52, finished 13th. In its last year, finished 25th in the ratings. But Blatz Beers caved into the NAACP, ended its advertising support of the show in June of 1953, and Bill Paley decided, out the door, we don't need you anymore. Women on TV. There were some women on TV in the early days of TV. Dinah Shore, See the USA, Drive a Chevrolet. Betty White, who is still alive. She had a show, a local show in Los Angeles, which I'll get to in a minute. Eve Arden, Artemis Brooks. Remember Artemis Brooks? Margie, My Little Margie, Gail Storm. and Charles Farrell as her father, and she watched her father, if you remember that. Loretta Young had soap opera type shows, evening dramas. In syndication, you never saw this. She decided that she did not want to be portrayed as an early version of Loretta Young because she got older and she didn't want the audiences to remember the younger version of Loretta Young because she wasn't young anymore. And Ann Sothern, executive director Ann Sothern, of course, the voice of My Mother the Car in 1965, arguably one of the worst TV shows ever. And the odd thing about that is those guys who wrote the show went on to do other things like the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The Donna Reed Show, this is a show which is kind of interesting in that she is the decision maker in the household, not her husband. So it's women are gaining some traction. The show, which I don't have up here because it wasn't the 1950s, is Petticoat Junction, where Kate Bradley is actually the center of the show. She is the businesswoman running the Shady Rest Hotel. That's the first show to have the woman who is the actual breadwinner of the family. Spring Byington, the December Bride. And this one, yoo-hoo, Mrs. Goldberg, Gertrude Berg. And this show is rather sad when you look at the history of it. And Zero Mostel wrote letters about this during his days when he was blacklisted because of what happened here. That is Gertrude Berg on the right. That is her husband, who was played by Philip Loeb. And let's get into this a little bit. First of all, take a look at Gertrude Berg. She's not good looking. She's elderly. And she pitches a show on radio about Jewish immigrants in the Bronx assimilating to the United States. Somehow she gets it onto television. Like I said, a lot of ethnic shows back in those days. And Philip Loeb is her husband. They got George Washington there, and they're going to be the all-American family, except Loeb is outed as a communist. The radio show moves to TV in 1949. Gertrude Berg creates the show, plays Molly Goldberg. It is the first situation comedy on TV, or comedy on TV in that vein. Desi Arnaz invents how you shoot a comedy. The show was killed because the co-star, Loeb, was accused of being a communist. Without Loeb on the show, it stumbled on NBC and on Dumont. Loeb would eventually commit suicide because he was outed as a communist as part of the Red Channels. Zero Mostel wrote a few letters about how angry he was that his friend lost his job and then committed suicide because he was outed without any proof. That was a 1950s problem. Another problem in the 1950s is this guy, Arthur Duncan. Arthur Duncan executes some fancy footwork to the music of Doing the New Lowdown when the Lawrence Welk Show salutes the romantic and fun month of June today at 6:30. Well, Arthur Duncan's first TV appearances were not on the Lawrence Welk Show. They were on the Betty White Show. And Betty White was winning accolades from Sarnoff and everybody else at NBC, from sponsors. We love you, Betty. You're great. You're this, you're that, you're this, you're that. But Betty, there is a problem, and we want to talk to you about this problem. This guy, Arthur Duncan, no, we can't have him on. And Betty White said, if I can't have Arthur on the show, then I can't be on the show. She quit. She defended Arthur Duncan and walked out. Betty White Show. Of course, we have all the Westerns in the 1950s. That's James Gardner as Maverick. Playhouse 90, Cowboys and Indians, Gary Moore. Gary Moore was a big deal. He was making over $2 million a year when CBS canned him in 1964. He had that night show that featured Carol Burnett. It was really Carol Burnett's show, but Gary Moore, who was Jimmy Durante's partner on radio. Gary Moore did an afternoon show, did I've Got a Secret, and the evening show. Art Linkletter, House Party, soap operas, variety shows, all, oh man, let me fix this rolling here, all on TV. And then there's one of my favorite TV characters, Maynard G. Krebs. You know what the G stood for? Walter. Maynard G. Krebs, Max Schulman, who wrote the show Dobie Gillis, hit pay dirt with Maynard G. Krebs. He was member of the counterculture, member of the Beat Generation. Now, some people suggested Maynard G. Krebs was the prototype of the 1960s hippie. No, he wasn't. Not at all. Maynard has a goatee, wears a ripped sweatshirt, has a love of jazz, uses the light vocabulary, and has no time for girls. He basically was a guy of the 1950s in Corax, in like Jack Kerouac and others of that time, who were not hippies, who were beatniks. The quiz show scandals, I'm going to go through this real quick. Basically, shows were cooked, like the 21 show where Van Doren took a dive. Rather, Stempel took a dive to allow Van Doren to win. Herb Stempel was coached by the producer, Dan Enright, to allow Charles Van Doren to win the game. Stempel took the fall. A year later, he told the New York Journal American's Jack O'Brien that his run as champion on 21 had been choreographed and that he had been ordered to purposely lose his championship to Van Doren, sort of like pro wrestling. The DA took a look into whether there was any wrongdoing. They didn't do anything, but Congress looked at it and they decided they were going to regulate game shows after that. And game shows are more tightly regulated than news broadcasts on TV these days. All thanks to 21. And I'm going to just skip that because there's a lot there, but Enright came back along with Jack Barry, who was part of that show, and they did Joker's Wild in the 1980s together. But Congress in 1960 amended the Communications Act in 1934, which prohibited the fixing of quiz shows. Bob Barker had a quiz show back then called Truth or Consequences. Now, this is Jeopardy! Alex Trebek just passed away about 9 days ago, and he was the host of Jeopardy! In the United States for 37 seasons, or 36 and a half years, and Art Fleming before that. Show was created by Merv Griffin. Merv Griffin was part of the Goodson-Todman family of shows, and he had hosted, he sat in for people like Bud Collyer on To Tell the Truth and Price is Right with Bill Cullen. And he learned a lot. He learned an awful lot while he went to, as he called it, Goodson-Todman School. And he decided he wanted to get into the game show business. And he had an idea for a show. The show would be a question and answer show, but he was afraid of all these new regulations. So he's driving around with his wife one day, and he says, "What am I supposed to do?" He said, I'm afraid. And she said, "Well, Merv, why don't you just give them the answers and let them ask the questions?" Hey, that's it. This is Jeopardy! 1964, all because Merv's wife said, "Give them the answers. You give them the answer. Give them the answers. Let them ask questions." John Cameron Swayze. Well, this is when he's not pitching Timex. It took a licking, but it's still ticking. The Anchorman. He is the Anchorman, the first real Anchorman on TV. Although Douglas Edwards was on CBS, but he dressed the part of the Anchorman. Look at him. The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. Except not quite. They didn't quite do all the news. They kind of held back on some of the news. Yeah, R.J. Reynolds handed over its news production to NBC. But, okay, go hire an anchor. They did. John Cameron Swayze. Start February 16th, 1949. Running time, 15 minutes. Okay, 7:45. Okay, we got the Camel News Caravan. It's the news format that's still used today, but maybe you shouldn't do all the news. Just bear with me. NBC News reports were not allowed to show no smoking signs. There was only one figure permitted to smoke a cigar. That was Winston Churchill. And for some reason, when NBC asked R.J. Reynolds if it could broadcast special news reports when the Korean War started, they said no. They censored the news. Morrow didn't censor the news. He went after Joe McCarthy. See It Now, March 9th, 1954, a report on Senator Joe McCarthy, red baiting the whole bit, and getting the communists and everybody out. CBS and NBC do have a large presence at this point. But McCarthy got mad, and he wanted equal time, and Morrow said, bring it on. For a show, CBS did not allow Morrow to promote the show with their money or use the CBS I logo. The show, the original show, used McCarthy's words against him. Morrow and McCarthy faced off on April 6, 1954. I'll tell you what, Morrow would be a refreshing face around here today. He didn't hold back. He actually committed the crime of journalism. He asked questions and basically toppled Joe McCarthy. But Bill Paley wasn't very happy about that at CBS. They were clashing, and by 1960, Morrow was gone. His last thing for CBS was Harvest of Shame about California migrant workers in 1960. And that last show is still fresh today. We get into the 1960s, and we're almost at the end here of the early days of TV. Richard Nixon, who I first met in 1985, who I can tell you had no personality. And I dealt with him because he comes back into prominence because he settles the Major League Baseball umpires dispute in 1985 and hangs out at Yankee Stadium and Shea Stadium, where I got to meet him a few times and got to talk to him a number of times. Anyway, this is the 1960 first presidential debate, and this is where visual becomes really important. Eisenhower and Stevenson didn't have any debates, and neither one of them was particularly appealing to see on TV. But John Kennedy, according to women who have done this talk for a long time, they looked at Kennedy. He was so handsome, every hair in place. He's wearing a suit that matches the background, the black and white background. Of course, his father is a studio operator, movie studio operator. And to his left is Richard Nixon. He's got a bad knee, and he can't put weight on his knee. And he's got a 5 o'clock shadow, and his clothes are hanging on him. And he's kind of sweaty, and he looks like he was on the New York City subway line, the IRT, on July 23rd, 1960. He's in a packed car, packed in like a sardine, and the car has no air conditioning. It's about 123 degrees inside the car, whereas Kennedy looks like he just came out of a spa. This is the first time that you watched it, and Kennedy looks presidential. Nixon looks like somebody off of the subway. And I've talked over the years to women who watched this, and they said they voted for Kennedy because Kennedy had the look. Nixon didn't have the look. In college, I had to, we got the Mahwah Library got a copy of this where I went to college, and I sat in a room and I watched it with a librarian because they had the old projector. And I turned my back and listened to it. And I had to do a report. What did you notice about the TV? What did you hear on radio? And to be honest with you, it was the tale of two debates. It was the first debate. They had 4 debates. They had Howard K. Smith, who was the moderator, and they had 4 people asking questions at all 4 debates, not like today. But it changed politics, and TV would become a great political force because of the visuals. That's Newton Minow. Newton Minow is watching television at this point. He takes over as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in 1961 as Kennedy is elected. And Newton Minow gives a talk. Whoops, that is also the Minow. Ooh, I made a mistake here. That's the skipper and the SS Minow. Oh, wait a minute. What did I do here? Oh, I know what I did. Minow gives a talk about television becoming the vast wasteland because they're doing all kind of entertainment. They're doing this, they're doing that, but they're not reporting the news the way they should. Meanwhile, there's a guy by the name of Sherwood Schwartz, who's writing this pilot for a TV show that's being filmed in Hawaii on November 22nd, 1963. And it's about all these people marooned on the desert island, and they are washed up to shore on the SS Minnow, spelled with 2 N's. Schwartz believed that Minnow was trying to ruin television. And we leave with this. We leave with Lucy. Lucy. She is the first Trekkie. Lucy, by this point in 1964-65, is the head of Desilu Studios. She divorces Desi Arnaz, and he decides he's getting out of business. You take over the business. Lucy becomes one of the most powerful business women in the United States in the 1960s, believe it or not. Most people say, Lucy? Oh, that's because she was a comedian. No, she ran the studio. And this show, this particular show, shows you how tough she was. Star Trek, she was the first Trekkie. And there she is, running Desilu. Lucille Ball gets 2 proposals for Star Trek. Now, 2 proposals. Yeah, I'll get to the 2 proposals for Star Trek in a minute. But this is 1964. Gene Roddenberry comes in and wants to sell Star Trek, Wagon Train in Space. Wagon Train was a show on ABC. The other is Mission Impossible. The board of directors say, hey, you know what? Mission Impossible, that's a no-brainer. Star Trek, keep away from it. It's too expensive. Don't do it. Lucy didn't even know what the show was about initially. She thought it was about USO dancers going from Army base, Navy base to base to base to base. And Roddenberry explained that it was about space. And the board of directors said, don't bother with it. You know, it's going to cost us too much money. That's what Lucy said. Lucy said, do it. She does. They bring it to NBC. And NBC looks at it and says, you know, I don't know. I really don't know. We weren't too impressed. It was called The Cage. But you know what? There's that guy with the pointed ears. That guy with the pointed ears. You know, the Martian guy. Why don't you do this again? And let's see where it goes with the guy with the pointy ears. Now the board of directors gets the letter, and they have to go to Lucy and say, you know, they want another pilot, and we don't think it's worth the while. Lucy, no, do it. Just do it. She does. Show gets on the air in 1966. It lasts for 3 years. That's it. It's over. We'll never see it again. But they found out there was a loyal band of fans who love Star Trek, and it goes into syndication. And as Paul Harvey would say, now you know the rest of the story. There have been so many incarnations of Star Trek, and the brand is worth billions of dollars. The board of directors said, it's not worth it. Lucy said, do it. Lucy would sell Desilu to Paramount in the late 1960s. She had other shows on as well that were successful, but she decided she was getting older to get out of the business, take the $17, $18 million and run. And so she did. And that's television. That's the early days of TV. I know this probably ran a little long, but anyway, any questions or comments at this point about the early days of TV? You could unmute yourself.
Is it true that Bob Hope was on the first TV? It's purported that Bob Hope was on the first actual TV broadcast in 1927, or is that just myth?
That's a myth. That's a myth. I've never read that about him. In fact, Smithsonian Institute has a big Bob Hope exhibit, but I never saw about that. You know, he might have done something at some studio,
right.
You know, but, you know, 1927 is when they first had talkies and all. But, yeah, Bob Hope was a staple back in those days. Anybody else? Anybody else want to talk about your stroll down memory lane?
So
you didn't mention Bonanza, which was
that was a big show.
First shows to be broadcast entirely in color.
Yes, Bonanza, but you can't mention everything. You know, it's tough to mention all. Actually, the first show to be entirely in color was Buffalo Bob Smith and Howdy Doody. That was the first show that was done in color. By the way, that is me on Sam Donaldson show back in 2005. The guy to my left, or to my right there, to your left, is Jeff Morrell, who left ABC to become a Pentagon spokesperson. And I've lost contact with Jeff Morrell. One of the other guys who I knew on that show was Mark Halperin, who, believe it or not, for me, and he got fired because of sexual harassment. Mark was great to me. ABC put out a daily morning briefing to their stations, and I did a commentary for Westwood One Radio called The Politics of Sports Business, and every morning Mark put that out as item of interest. And it's sad what happened to Mark, but I was very grateful for Mark at that point in my life.
See you later, Evan.
Yep,
Oh,
thank
yeah.
you, Ted. Anybody else? Well, if nobody else has anything.
Some of the early programs were live,
Yes,
dramas and stuff, and I thought the writing was fabulous.
yeah, it was.
Big deal about doing live shows that you don't see it so much.
Well, ABC's tried to do that with rehashed scripts of All in the Family and the Jeffersons, and it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. But yeah, the early shows, a lot of them were live because it cost too much money with tape. And I talked to some people over the years who were around in the early days of TV, and they said, if you made a mistake, you just went on. Just went on. You didn't worry about the mistake. But, you know, you talk about live shows. I think your show of shows was live. And take a look at the writers on your show of shows.
Yeah, I love that program. Yeah.
Yeah, your show, I mean, you know, Mel Brooks was, what, 30 years old at the time when he did that show. So, and all those other people. Great walk down memory lane. Wow, you must have been Joe Franklin fans. Martin Paint. Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor was Joe Franklin's favorite performer. But I got a question for you about Joe Franklin. You might know this, you might not know this. Who was Joe Franklin's best friend in high school? I'll do the Jeopardy thing. That's all I could do, because then I'll owe Merv Griffin money. Joe Franklin's best friend in high school was a guy by the name of Bernie Schwartz. And you probably know Bernie Schwartz by a different name. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was Joe Franklin's best friend. Anyway, anybody else before I wrap this thing up here? Okay, well, I want to thank everybody from the library for inviting me. I want to thank everybody who was part of this presentation. Thank you, Alfred. I appreciate that. And everybody stay safe. Have a good Thanksgiving, but stay safe during Thanksgiving, because you might want to be around during the subsequent holidays, and make it to when you get the vaccination. Thank you to the library for inviting me, and hopefully we'll see you somewhere down the line.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Evan.